The essential concepts in policy formation that I'm going to touch on are identify strategic assets, identify systemic vulnerabilities, identify bubbles, which is why these things collapse, the worst case scenario. Funding is an essential element of catastrophic planning, and we want to develop policies with built-in resilience and sustainability. How do you tell if something is unsustainable? Well, start with the audits and reviews. If they're any good, they're probably being attacked or criticized or smeared. Selfish interest groups protest because they want the funding to continue. They pretend it doesn't exist, such as in the current 2024 presidential campaign, where neither person wants to talk about it. You suppress discussion of it, and there's misinformation. And it's a worldwide crisis because there's much debt all over the world, and what's worse, the world is aging. The demographics promise more suffering, and I point out again, the aging population is more vulnerable and less able to help in a recovery and rebuild following a catastrophe. Just more cost, more mouths to feed, more need for shelters, more medical resources consumed. The beginning here is to identify a strategic asset. And this we do with our credit strength and credit reputation. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes and to pay the debts and to borrow money. Founding fathers recognized the dangers of national debt. George Washington, in his farewell address, pointed out that we had to preserve our use of credit as much as possible, keep it for times of war, pay it off in times of peace, and not ungenerously throw upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. The national debt in George Washington days was $70 million. Andrew Jackson is the last president to pay it down to zero. Lincoln ran it from $90 million to $2.68 billion for fighting the Civil War. Wilson fought World War I about $18 billion, and then FDR, the debt was $22.5 billion, and he ran it up to $236 billion in World War II. And our benchmark presidents, Eisenhower to Carter, were all much more frugal than the present lot. Eisenhower added $20 billion, Kennedy 16, all the way down to the total national debt at the end of the Carter administration was just $908 billion. That's less than $1 trillion. Obama was opposed to a balanced budget amendment, which started to gain some momentum back in the early 90s. We don't need a constitutional amendment to do our jobs and to make sure that the government is living within its means and making responsible choices. We don't need a balanced budget amendment. Of course, Barack Obama never once did his job. But Obama was not alone. There's seven other presidential failures. They're listed here. Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden has added $7.2 trillion in just 4 years, less than 4 years. The present national debt is a bubble on so many levels. It's a bubble being the best indicator of a catastrophe. Understand what happens when the first step is to prevent a catastrophe. And recognizing a bubble is that first step. We got financial bubbles involved here, monetary bubbles, demographic bubbles, credit bubbles are all present in the national debt. To solve it, we need to look at the federal expenditures as 6 separate categories. In Vietnam War, we went with a unified budget, which is a big misnomer and a way they used the boomer savings to pay for Vietnam and keep the national debt low by a unified budget. Now there's 6, I think it should be separated into 6 separate budgets and each one addressed separately so we know where the problem is and where we have to cut. And you shouldn't cut across these lines, as you'll see. Federal operations, the budget is $6.5 trillion. Social Security, the unfunded liability is $60 trillion and growing. Medicare, Medicaid is $103 trillion unfunded and growing. Debt service is $950 billion at the latest. It's going up steadily just since I made this slide. Fiscal risks, contingencies are unfunded. That's infinite. Catastrophic risk is unfunded and is infinite. We'll come back to that. Let's start with the federal deficit. 6.5 trillion, revenues are less than 5 trillion. Instead of raising revenues, we pander to voters by offering more tax cuts by both presidential candidates in the current 2024 presidential campaign. Congress is controlled by donations from selfish interest groups that want to protect their pet programs, pet tax breaks, and pet expenditures. The first step is to pass the balanced budget amendment, to add a check and balance to Congress and to presidents, all of whom have been failures since Carter. Social Security was originally set up as a solvent program with 10 working Americans for every one drawing Social Security. It's now less than 2 workers for every one drawing Social Security. Originally, age 65 was a life expectancy, so many would die before becoming a burden. Life expectancy is now 78. I'm thinking of transitioning from a man, which is 71 life expectancy, to a woman who's got an 80-some year life expectancy. That averages out to 78. And we have created further burdens like COLAs and early retirement. Just add to the Christmas tree of Social Security. Medicare, Medicaid, largest single unfunded program, not part of the national debt. We spend millions on even single drugs and on research with no chance that it'll ever pay off. We waste money on extending life. For what? If we extend life, that means old codgers will continue to draw on Social Security for even more. The national debt is over 35 trillion, growing by 2 trillion a year. Interest alone is almost 700 billion and growing. Well, it's 950 last time I checked. It's unconstitutional to default on the debt. We are the most ungenerous generation, according to George Washington, as we do intend to stick this debt to our posterity. Fiscal risks. Congress has pledged many times our credit worthiness for programs. The Pension Benefit Guarantee Fund is one classic example. State and local pensions are underfunded. A lot of private sector funds are underfunded. They're all going to require the PBG to make good on those pension. Flood insurance. I got a couple of flood insurance manuals right here. Mandatory purchase of flood insurance. Why do we do this? It's not for you, not for the owner. It's for the banking system, so that when floods ruin collateral, that the banks are reimbursed, not you. Sea levels can rise and 50% of all Americans live within 50 miles of the oceans. They're all flood insured. A lot of them shouldn't be. Fiscal risks continue: student loans, crop insurance, FDIC deposit insurance, environmental cleanup funds and the super funds, treaty obligations, housing guarantees in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, nuclear waste disposal, hazardous substances, defense contingent obligations. It's incredible how much we have in contingent liabilities, fiscal costs that we could further drive the nation to bankruptcy. Catastrophic risks. FEMA has blank checks for hurricanes, earthquakes, and covering losses for the public service announcements 1 to 5. The risks of losses grow with population. Worse, we tout treasury bonds as safe, and every U.S. business, banks, pensions, citizens, countries all over the world stash their emergency funds in treasuries. Guess what? When there's a catastrophe, everybody's going to want to cash in at once. That's a bubble. It can't be done. Instead, in a catastrophe, they'll suspend paying out treasuries, and there'll be no buyers for more treasury bonds in a catastrophe. Solutions. Read the references on the national debt and the history of how the balanced budget amendment was defeated by the Congress and President Clinton in 95 and again in 1997 when the debt was only about $5 trillion. Commitments and entitles need to be capped, limited, reduced, restricted. The more ways we can cut all these unfunded contingent liabilities, the sounder the fisc. Consequences. Read this book, When Money Dies. Hyperinflation racked Germany after World War I. Who got wiped out? and who survived and how did they do it. Who will be hit the hardest? People receiving entitlements. When the budget collapses, money fails, people who receive their entitlements won't get any. It's gone. Yet they fight for their COLAs while their entire payments are at risk. I got some ideas here for catastrophic policies. 1, balanced budget amendment, matching fiscal year budget to the prior year revenues. And if revenues go up, the excess is applied to the national debt. That's what we need. No more gimmicks to fund things like the current year budget. We come up with, we'll cut waste, we'll sell assets. No. Apply the fiscal year budget to the prior year revenues. 2, use long-term bonds at lower interest rates to finance the national debt, amortize over 50 years. 3, abolish the unified budget that was passed during the Vietnam War, and keep Social Security separately. Invest Social Security in assets that return money through the form of like the hardened electronic grid, and then charge rent to all the utilities to use the electronic grid. Build geothermal plants, energy plants. Geothermal energy is infinite. It doesn't carry the risks of nuclear, doesn't carry all the expenses of solar, or the next closest thing to it is hydropower, which is relying on gravity. But between that, these are the real clean, the green environments. Is geothermal energy, have Social Security funds used to build and then charge for the electricity created through geothermal energy plants. 4, impose ceilings and caps, eliminate expensive medicines and research for Medicare. Terminate all life expectancy research because it doesn't do anything for us. It only makes matters worse. 5, limits on contingent exposures and phase them out. 6, declaration of catastrophe and martial law in congressional defined catastrophe zones so that we can use the Army to maintain order in times of a catastrophe. Catastrophic Thinking will improve policy formation in America. The Essential Concepts video series will allow more and newer approaches to policies that will enable America to survive catastrophes. Catastrophes will be painful. The process to make us ready for them will be painful. That's why nobody wants to talk about it in Washington. The strategic asset of credit strength has been much neglected and abused. We need checks and balances like the Balanced Budget Amendment to protect us from ourselves, from Congress, and the presidents. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. I have a website that has a lot more information. There's my research, my protections, Essential Concepts videos. Please share, but give credit. And then I will end all my videos the same way with a prayer for peace. Thank you.